So it's my great pleasure to introduce Pilar Prieto, who is a research professor at the Department of Translation and Language Sciences at Universitat Pompeu Fabra, Barcelona, Catalonia. Pilar obtained her doctoral degree in Romance linguistics at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 1994. Her dissertation was on vowel lengthening in northern Italy, a case for segmental and prosodic optimization. Then she worked as a postdoctoral fellow at the famous Bell Labs in New Jersey, continuing her work on the linguistic meaning of prosody from a cross-linguistic point of view. Since 2008, she's been coordinating the Prosodic Studies Group at the Department of Translation and Language Sciences, again at Universitat Pompeu Fabra. In her research, Pilar focuses on a question how humans process prosodic and gestural patterns in speech. And then she also incorporates the results into semantic models. She establishes a link between experimental evidence and semantic models. And finally, she also investigates this link between prosody and gestures in different areas, such as first and second language acquisition, or the area of communication trainings for language-impaired population. And the social outreach, as you can imagine, is quite high, because she also proposes how to improve language abilities in populations with neurodevelopmental disorders. In her research, she also uses different methodology, analysis, but also eye tracking and neuronal techniques in collaboration with other groups. I would like to mention two books. I know one is written together with Sonia Frota on intonation in Romance, published in 2015 by Oxford University Press. And another one that is actually on my desk now is on the development of prosody in first language acquisition. I highly recommend that book. It's published. It was published by John Benjamin's Amsterdam. And last but not least, Pilar allowed me to share some personal information. In her free time, she likes cooking for her family and friends. Her risotto makes everybody happy, and I really regret that we can't taste it. She loves nature. She enjoys mountain climbing. And I also know Pilar as a very passionate, engaged fighter for Catalan independence. Pilar, thank you for agreeing to deliver the talk. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Martina, for the nice introduction, and also for both Manfred, Cornelia, and Martina for the nice invitation. I really look forward to the discussion, and I really like to have this opportunity to present some of the work that tries to show the relationship between prosody and gesture. So thank you very much. So yes, going to review some work on this relationship between intonation and gesture. So the roadmap for these 40 minutes can be first to talk about how recently gesture studies have highlighted the high interconnection between speech and gesture from both a temporal and pragmatic point of view. In my view, this view lacks some knowledge about the role of prosody in this interconnection. And we really lack a comprehensive description of the contribution of these prosodic and bodily features in the marking of pragmatic meanings. And this is a little contribution to this. So in this talk, I will show the results of a set of production and perception experiments that try to assess the interplay between prosodic and gestural features of language related to some aspects of pragmatics, like the marking of polite stance, the marking of reject cross speech acts, so incredulity questions in this case, and then something on the marking of information structure. the underlying idea behind these results that I will show is that both prosodic and gestural features of language work as interdependently as sister systems, and they do similar functions. And I'd like to put the proposal that we really need to jointly integrate them in models of pragmatics, if perhaps semantics. So see. Okay, so these are the collaborators. You'll see them in the different experiments in several groups, right? Some of them are postdocs already, and others are more international collaborators. So I really thank, the really nice groups that I had the luck of having these years. So this is some of the results that I will present have some years already. Okay, so just to start with, just some background on the prosodic and gestural features of language, I think we would agree that human face-to-face communication is multimodal and relies on this dynamic exchange involving not only verbal content, but also bodily movements, facial expressions, and prosodic features, such as intonation, timing, intensity patterns, etc. They all work together to mark meaning, right? So McNeil's important study, book in 1992, Hand in Mind, What Gestures Reveal About Thought, is a very nice book to read, and it is considered now the start of gestures, the modern gesture studies. Right there, he basically focuses on manual co-speech gestures, and argues throughout the book that co-speech gestures are meaningfully integrated from a semantic, pragmatic, and temporal point of view to speech, right? So he talks about the semantic and pragmatic synchrony rules. He talks about the phonological synchrony rule, and he dedicates a lot of time to really argue for this integration, right? My question here is, what is the role of prosody in these gesture speech integration patterns, right? Now I will present some evidence from the phonological synchrony rule. In there, the role of prosody is very clear, right? How prosody acts as an anchor point for gestures, but the semantic and pragmatic part is more vague right now, right? So I think there's a need to do more work on this part. So just revising a little bit the phonological synchrony rule, right now we have lots of evidence from many languages in which we see this pattern of having co-speech gestures. So the most prominent part of co-speech gestures, like the stroke and apexes, really co-occurring with the most prominent parts of speech, like prosodic heads or pitch accents, right? And this is a constant even for tonal languages, and we find this pattern, right? And I like to show one nice example that we have in which we, in an experimental work that we did with Nuria, we show how pointing in this experimental task is so much really finely integrated from a temporal point of view to contrastive pitch accents, right? So we really find this pattern that you see here, the rising pitch accent, so the peak of the intonational low plus high start is really coinciding with the apex of the pointing gesture in this experimental task. So just to show you a graph of this, look at how well integrated it was, right? So the distance between the gesture apex and the F0 peak in the low plus high start pitch accent for this contrastive focus was, it's very, very tight, right? The relationship, it amounts to 0 almost, right? So within some variation, of course, right? But it is interesting to see this monosyllabic effect on the left, right? This part, I don't know if you see my cursor here. You see that when you have a monosyllabic, so that is a phrase boundary coming up, what happens is that the apex really turns back, right? So we see also how prosodic structure is important for the actual fine-grained, temporal development of gestures, right? So what we can say by looking at these and many other results is the following, right? That prosodic heads, that is prosodic prominence, and edges, phrasing, are key in predicting temporal locations for gesture, apexes, and strokes. So that is gesture dynamics is really constrained by prosodic structure. So this has clear effects on what pragmatic synchrony is about, right? Because when we think about if prosody is really an anchor point for gesture, that means that gesture is visualizing the functions, some of the functions of prosody, right? Like these ones here, right? So we see how, in many studies, you have prosodic and gestural association with prominence on the one hand, and prosodic and gestural marking of phrasing. And what this means is that since we know that prosodic prominence encodes information structure in some languages, then the visual effects of these is that these gestures are also visualizing this information structure. That's the hypothesis, right, behind these. And I think we have some nice results out there also showing these, right? Regarding to phrasing, same thing, right? We see how if we see that gesture is accompanying phrasing from a prosodic point of view, then we are also visually, not only prosodically, but also visually encoding syntactic marking, prosodic groupings, turn taking, etc. Right? That's the idea that you do it together, right? Okay, so, but not only this, right? We know that, and that's the part that perhaps was missing in the gesture speech synchrony rules, the role of prosody, not only as a temporal role of just, integrating gesture into the structure, right, into the prosodic structure, but also the meaning of prosodic, the prosodic meaning itself, right? So that we know that on a variety of pragmatic functions like polite stance, speech act marking, knowledge state, expressive stance have both, the expressions through prosody and through visual cues. So what we're doing what we have been doing in the last few years is to really investigate the effects of, I do not see them, it cannot move, okay, now. Yeah, the actual these three components, we have tried to investigate them jointly. Okay, so despite all this, we know, right, that the joint analysis of the prosodic and gestural components plays still a marginal role in correct pragmatic analysis of language, right? So in this talk, I will present the results of a set of empirical studies in order to assess this interplay in the marking of some pragmatic operations, and I will review the interaction between prosodic and gestural marking in a set of experiments involving three areas: polite stance, speech act marking, well, specifically this disagree component, incredulity component, and information structure marking. So let's start. This is the structure of the talk. So let's start with study one, right? Which involves a set of studies. Like the actual question is, how do we know how we are multimodally marking, that is using prosody and gesture, polite stance across languages. And in here, I wanted to share some nice results on this area, because there is a recent nice, meta-analytic review on several languages that show some very nice patterns of prosodic mitigation to start with. So I'd like to present this article coordinated by Goethe-Winter has been just published. This is this reference here, right? And what we have also collaborated with the Catalan data in here. And the idea of this meta-analytic review was to really reanalyze the data on, politeness marking, prosodic marking of politeness, specifically in polite request, in some studies that had very similar methodologies to start with, right? And what Bodo and collaborators do is just to reassess these data. So we have these languages here on the left: Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Catalan, Austrian, German, and Russian. And we wanted to see what were the effects of F0 specifically on the polite and impolite speech. And these, since the patterns that were found in all these studies independently were against the frequency code, because the frequency code in a way is stating that F0 in polite conditions should be higher, and what we're finding is that it is lower, right? So it's a kind of a prosodic mitigation. That's how we interpret it, right? So this comparison was done because it could be done because the experiments had very similar discourse completion task methodologies, and they were based on speakers' free responses to contextual prompts. So I want to show you these results that really coincide for most of the languages. There's only one exception. And the results clearly show the reduced F0 levels in polite conditions, so against the prediction of the frequency code, right? Here you see the F0 difference, fundamental frequency difference between the polite and not polite speech conditions, right? And you see that all of them are negative, right? And I think the only one that was not significant was the one for Chinese, but you see this mitigation effect, right? So in no case we find the expected effect of having higher F0, right? So many of these studies found evidence not only of reduced levels of F0, but also reduced levels of intensity, breathy voice, right? Which coincides with prosodic mitigation idea, as well as, of course, mitigation in the verbal domain, use of hedging devices, etc. So that's what happened at the prosodic level. So do we have evidence of what is happening at the gesture level in these polite conditions? So we only have two studies on this, Korean, right? And also using a different corpus, and also Catalan, but Catalan is really using the same corpus here. So we analyzed prosody, and then in a couple of years later, we analyzed the gestural patterns. What we see in here is that, again, we see gesture mitigation patterns in these polite conditions, both for Korean and Catalan. So for Korean, what we find is less amplitude in the gesture behavior when you compare polite versus impolite conditions. So the gestures are not so wide, not so ample, right? And for Catalan, we see that there are fewer facial and body cues in the polite condition, as well as more hedging behavior in general. So I wanted to show you one example of this. For the targets, I want to just very briefly compare the targets, more or less the target sentences were the same for the two conditions. The only thing is that one recipient was more like an equal status recipient, and the other was of a higher status recipient. For the equal status condition, you see that a request like asking someone to proofread a short Portuguese text is expressed as follows, as you see, here by this speaker. She's very expressive, right? If you see the contrast with the superior status condition, so asking the same to a superior status recipient, you see how her, the number of the expressiveness in her face, right? Also, if you look at the amplitude of the movements are not as strong, right? So that's when we do this quantitative analysis, that's what we find, right? A relationship between this prosodic and gestural mitigation. So the conclusion of this is that we are seeing prosody and gesture acting in a similar way, right, in the marking of polite stance. Well, we only have evidence from two languages, but it seems that in general there is an integration, right, between, well, there's some interdependency between the amplitude patterns of gesture and prosody, right? And this, I think it's a very nice thing to investigate too, right? And also, you know, for some papers, verbal mitigation devices were there, right? So it's everything, it's then the idea that when you are in a polite context, you tend to mitigate and use all the devices you can, right? Both from a prosodic, gestural, and verbal point of view, right? So this potential cross-linguistic dependency, right, might be at play between this prosodic strength, like pitch range, and gesture strength, like stroke amplitude. But we'll see that this is not what happens in other areas, right? So the things are not that easy. Okay, so this is something we see, that how prosody and gesture, you know, have similar patterns in this case. But if we want to investigate the relative contribution on gesture in prosody, then we probably need to use some specific designs, right? And some empirical studies that can assess, for example, an audio-only condition, a video-only condition, an audiovisual condition with congruent and incongruent mismatches between intonation and gesture, right? I mean, this will give us a lot of information about, you know, what are their respective contributions, right? What happens when they are congruent and incongruent. And well, so I will present some evidence that we can discuss on these, right? There are some interesting results. The underlying idea is that you'll see that the gesture and prosody are contributing similar, similar functions, even though the strength might be different depending on the exact case, right? So we'll see what we can discuss all of these, right? Okay, so for speech act marking, so let's focus on the reject or disagree operation, right? Let's look at the, you know, at these comparison that we did some years ago between Catalan and Dutch, right? Where intonation is marking incredulity questions in a very different way. So we use this difference to assess what is the role of gesture, which is then very similar across the two languages. Okay, so that the idea is to assess what is the interplay between gesture and prosody in this marking of reject operations. Well, as you know from other, previous, you know, study that I presented to you some time ago, right? But I think that you've heard about this study, right? Is that question intonation in Catalan codes several epistemic operations, and degrees of epistemic commitment is one of them, then degrees of epistemic agreement also, right? And one of the findings of these studies that, and these were very clear, is that the incredulity pitch contour, or the disagreement pitch contour in questions is realized through a low star plus high pattern. And this coincides, in fact, with info-seeking questions. So neutral and incredulity questions have the same contour, even though incredulity has stronger or more expanded pitch ranges, but phonologically, it's probably the same pitch pattern, right? And it sounds something like this. Let's see if I can. Okay, sorry, this is the final fall, so I cannot access right now because it's covered by the, sorry. Okay, something like tens gana, right? So like a high boundary tone. Okay, so facial gestures for this agreement. This is very interesting how some recent studies, and with a very nice work by Benítez Quiroz, that has documented facial expression that are very similar across languages, even though this has been contested too. And I don't agree with part of it, but this disagreement phase, we find in our recording some, at least some overlapping features with what he proposes, right? So what the participants did across these 4 languages is like slightly furrowing the eyebrows pursing their lips, raise their chins, right? And this was common to the 4 languages, and this was prompted in an experiment, just having a prompt that was trying to make the participants disagree, right? So like saying to them, well, a study shows that university tuition should increase by 30%. What do you think? Then many of the young people express like really a disagreement with these, right? So that's generally what we find across languages, even though with, I think here, well, we can discuss this if you're interested, right? But in general, right, I mean, this is a quite common phase that expresses incredulity and disagreement, right? Okay, so that's Catalan. Info-seeking question, you see the final part of the pitch contour where it's a low star high, but then incredulity is a low star high with but expanded pitch range, right? But the form of the intonation contour is the same. For Dutch, you see the difference here. The main difference is that the incredulity question goes like low plus high star, low high. Something like hola, nana, something like this, right? Like it's definitely very different and perceptually different from info-seeking questions. So I wanted to see, given these, what are the effects of gestures, right? When you try to have an understanding, an identification experiment. And we, after some piloting, we saw very similar facial patterns for incredulity questions, right? As you see for Catalan or Dutch, you see this eyebrow furrowing, this movement of the head, right? And it's quite more or less intense, but it's quite similar. Okay, so the methodology, we had 2 experiments. So one, the first experiment was carried out with 20 listeners of each language. And it was a perception experiment with audio only. It's stimuli, video only stimuli, and audiovisual stimuli, incongruent and incongruent intonation and gestural combinations. And experiment 2 was the same, but there we had the AV stimuli incongruent and incongruent intonation and gesture combination. So we added the incongruent combinations to see what happened. For here, we basically explain, right, how to do it. So if you're interested in the details, we can talk about them later. So the results for experiment 1, for the congruent cases, you see in here the proportion of correct identification or either info-seeking or incredulity, right, for the 2 languages. And you see how the audio-only condition is the one that is lower in the 2 languages, the one in the left, right? So it's lower to identify the incredulity, meaning just accessing the actual intonation than when you add the vision, right? So that's what you see here, stronger rates of identification for video only and AV stimuli, so lower rates for AO. There you see a difference between Catalan and Dutch on the left, right? And these are the lower rates of identification for audio-only stimuli for Catalan. And this makes sense because actually we know that phonologically they are low star high, so they are the same intonational form, right? So that makes sense. So what happens when we combine them into congruent or incongruent matches, right? So that's experiment 2. AV, basically an audiovisual experiment. And here you see the rate of incredulity responses, right? And crucially, these are combinations of phase and contour, right? So vision and contour in either incredulity, II, right? So the one on the left for the 2 graphs is II, meaning that phase incredulity, contour incredulity. The second is phase incredulity, neutral contour. The second one is neutral phase contour, right? So the one, if you follow the x-axis. So what you clearly see in here is that you find stronger rates of identification for congruent incredulity phase plus pitch contour, the one on the left on the 2 languages, and the one on the right, which is the congruent neutral in the 2 graphs, right? So that's what we see when things are congruent, things are fine, top or bottom. right? But what happens with incongruent stimuli here, right? What happens is that phase wins in a way, right? In the two languages, but to very different degrees too, right? So if the phase is incredulity, no matter if you put the contour as incredulity with a neutral phase, this is going to win, right? So vision in this case is very dominant in the two languages, but is more dominant for Catalan than for Dutch, right? Because for Dutch you have specifically a phonological pitch contour really identifying incredulity, which is something you don't have for Catalan. So this relative weight is different depending on the language, right? So the conclusion from this experiment is that the results reveal the importance of facial cues in the identification of incredulity meaning. So even if they are alone, they are fine, then they work as audio cues, even in a stronger way. However, Dutch and Catalan express incredulity using two pitch contours with distinct phonological features, influencing the weight assigned to intonational and visual cues. This is a really nice way to see that this is not always the same, right? So in the two languages, when incongruent visual input is added to the auditory input, the final perception changes drastically, right? So results in part, match with the McGurk effect at the suprasegmental level, in the sense that visual input for incredulity meaning actively competes with the prosodic input, and it allows it to change the meaning in some cases, right? Okay, so for information structure, let's I have two parts, production and perception. See if I can go through the two of them. The production part is on the multimodal marking of information structure. And these are very recent results from Patrick Rohrer's dissertation. He's been working on coding TED Talks for a while with the idea that looking at information structure and other pragmatic meanings here. The research questions for this production experiment was to look at how does prominence in prosody and gesture work together to mark the information status of reference in English TED Talks. And the second, does the degree of prosodic prominence, and this has been claimed before in a couple of studies, relate whether this degree of prosodic prominence relates to the degree of gesture prominence and also to the degree of newness. Okay, let's just see a typical example of it.
So books and journal articles are kind of like a form of currency for scholars. Publishing articles helps you get tenure and more research grants down the road.
Okay, so you see a lot of manual gestures here. What we did, this was coded by Patrick, all of the levels. This is results from 5 English speakers and 23 minutes of an analyzable multimodal speech, and was annotated in 3 separate layers independently. And this was information status of reference and other levels of information structure also, but we're not reporting on these, were coded. So in this case, it was coded reference, were coded into new, given, and accessible, gestures as referential and non-referential. And then we had many prosodic Toby annotations, and the ones we're going to talk about is accented versus unaccented, and also pitch accent types. Also, the data analysis was carried out in R, where this fluent speech was excluded. A referent was considered accented if there was one or more pitch accents present within that constituent, and a referent was considered associated with a gesture if one or more gesture apexes were present within that constituent. But this is just a methodology issue. So the results are quite interesting. How does prominence in prosody and gesture work together to mark ISR in English TED Talks? These are the results here. You see how they are separated into new reference, accessible, and given reference, and how they are marked, the percentage of marking, right? You see how new reference, and similarly to accessible reference, are 75% marked with accent and gesture present. And practically the rest is accented with no gesture, right? More or less the same happens in accessible reference, but given reference are very different, right? Even though, I mean, you still have, right, 25 or accented and gesture present. We're thinking about also contrastive topics. We need to reanalyze the given data here, because the expectation was that it was even lower, right, for the accented and gesture marking. So these are the results, right? I mean, new and accessible reference are mostly marked by both prosodic and gesture prominence, and given reference are less associated with gesture and prosodic prominence. You see in here, like what happened in the politeness case, that the two components are working together, right? So what does the degree of prosodic prominence, now talking about degrees, right, relate to the degree of gesture prominence and degree of newness? Here's the results. You see in here from, to the right, the pitch accent types, and, in different shades, you see the degree of prominence of these pitch accent types. And the idea, the expectation was that low plus higher star would be like a very strong pitch accent, and would be more related to new information. And this is what happened in some corpora that had been analyzed, even though not very big, right? So this is not getting confirmed here, right? You do not see any increase, right, of strong accents in new and accessible information. So that's not really confirmed. Right, while new and accessible reference do tend to receive more pitch accentuation, there is no clear patterns indicating that new information receives a more prominent pitch accents. So that's how it is, right? Gestures add visual prominence to discourse, working in a parallel fashion to prosody, to mark discourse, new and accessible reference, at least for English, and hope also expectedly Germanic languages. And we have very nice also recent data on Catalan. It works a little bit different. And we see no one-to-one mapping clearly between prosodic prominence and gesture prominence, right? I mean, see something different from what we saw with politeness. Okay, so let's just talk. This is the last, I will go a little fast. I don't know how I'm doing with time, but this is the last little experiment, and then we'll go to the conclusions. So we wanted to see also what happens from a prominence, from a perception point of view, right? In this case, we wanted to see what is the contribution of prosodic prominence and gestural prominence to the perception of contrastive focus. And this is the study, which was published several years ago. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the multimodal marking of contrastive focus, which is similar to what we saw with TED Talks, right? Basically, while broad focus tends to be higher star in Catalan, we have contrastive focus, more instances of low plus high star, and this is similar to English, right? For the visual patterns, we tend to find also head nods and manual movements, right? Eyebrow raises associated with contrastive focus, right? So we decided to run an experiment, but in this case, really having like degrees of controlling not only one versus the other, but degrees of visual prominence and degrees of prosodic prominence. And this was done also in 3 conditions. This is the intonation stimuli, so have several steps. I think there were 4 steps in total between broad focus and contrastive focus. Sorry, I have a problem, I think, with the, now, just a second. I think in this way you see me, because I have a problem with the sun here. So I don't think you were seeing. Are you seeing me now?
Yes, we can see.
Sorry about this.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay, so that's the intonation stimuli. And these are the visual stimuli, and this was done with avatars. What you see in here are the 4 stimuli. Unfortunately, I cannot play them for you, but you see in the 4 rows are the 4 stimuli that we had, and that you see how eyebrows at the top level were not very high, or not even starting with a head nod. And you see the last row in the middle, how the face was really moving down with a strong head nod, and also the eyebrows were going up. I hope you see the gradation in here, right? So the combination, these are nice results, because what you see is that first, audio only and video only patterns, the gradual patterns, work similarly, right? You see these two, audio only and video only, really the steps really generate the identification of contrastive focus, when head nods are more intense, right? Or when pitch range is stronger, this generates more and more answers towards contrastive focus. So that's very clear. And what happens with the combinations of these, this is what the graph in the middle in the audiovisual condition. For the audiovisual condition, what you see is that the intonation, right, the effects of gesture are stronger when combined with intonation stimuli that are not as strong, like 1 or 2, right? You see how gesture, right, is they are stronger. So the ones on the bottom, you see that gesture has more effect because the intonation is not as strong. So there's really an interplay between the two, right? Okay, so the main results here are that really both gesture and prosodic features are central to the interpretation. So that in the audio only and the vision only condition. And when you combine the two, you see that listeners are more sensitive to one of the modalities when the other is weaker, right? So you are constantly, as a listener, just evaluating the two, right? And it's nice because we had a follow-up experiment in the same article, just that showed that head nod and eyebrow movements contribute really individually to the perception of contrastive focus, but head nods are more perceptually salient and they are really more effective than eyebrow movements. You could see more responses drawn by head nods than by eyebrow movement. So that's interesting too, this competition between cues in the visual space, right? So the final conclusions from these 3 studies are the following. Let's see if I can summarize a little bit all of them. So prosody and gesture, the claim is that they act as sister and complementary systems in the marking of these meanings that we saw: polite stance, speech act, and information structure marking. From a production point of view, we saw evidence for joint prosodic and gestural mitigation strategies to indicate polite stance, and this is a cross-linguistic, this is very clear for prosody, and we have less evidence cross-linguistically for gesture, but they seem to work in similar ways. So evidence for joint prosodic and gestural marking of reject operators, and also similar patterns in the use of prosodic and gestural prominence in the marking of information status of reference. Mixed evidence we found about prosody and gesture prominence dependencies, right? And this is a nice topic. So from a perception point of view, we find evidence for strong influence of visual patterns on pragmatic interpretations, right? And, and the effect is really modulated by listeners, right? Who really assess online the strength of the different cues. And that's probably what we're doing when we speak, right? We're really aware of these features and we're aware of the competition between them. Okay, so finally, our experiments show that listeners are sensitive to this interplay during pragmatic interpretation. We need a more fine-grained and unified approach to integrate the study of gestural and intonational features, its complementary systems, with other parts of language. And this is due to a little discussion that we had with Cornelia this morning. So following up on Cornelia's very nice paper, 2019 paper, I agree that both intonation and gesture are supporting actors in language, and I also believe that they need to be vindicated, and that perhaps no one from the two should win the Oscar, right? But that that depending on the situation, the specific, expressivity even, right? That can affect intonation and gesture also on an individual basis, can be, can change, right? The dominance of one over the other, right? So that's more or less it. So thank you, and looking forward to the comments.
Thank you very much, Pilar. And now I would like to ask Cornelia to provide her comments on the talk. You are a co-host, so you can share the screen.
So yeah, thank you, Pilar, for the great talk. And I'm actually very honored that I'm the one who can open the discussion. And I think that Pilar and I are in line with almost all issues. So I won't have any like very controversial or provocative things to say. I would just like to add some little things to what Pilar said. The core insight I take it from her talk is that prosodic and gestural features of language can be regarded as sister systems, and that both have to be integrated into models of pragmatics. And so what I would like to add to these two important insights that Pilar brought up is whether we can really infer that they are sister systems, or they could, I think, or it could be the case that there's more like a mother-daughter relationship, if you want. I will elaborate on that in a minute. And of course, Pilar and I, we both think that it's a sister relationship, but I think this has to be shown really. And then is it only a matter of integrating these gesture input into models of pragmatics, or should we also think about semantic contributions? So what we've seen is that prosody and gesture both encode pragmatic features in language, and that there's an interesting interplay between gesture and prosody in the marking of pragmatic meaning. And to elaborate on what I first brought up, my question would be whether the two systems are really independent and synchronized in a way, or whether one is really secondary and parasitic on the other. So concretely, the question is whether gesture is secondary and just aligns, say, with the prosodic head or the pitch. That could be the case. So then gesture wouldn't actually mark pragmatic features, but just sit on the pitch or so. And I think one case in point could be to look at de-accentuation or second occurrence focus data. So if gesture simply aligned with prosody, then we would not expect that gestural marking and prosodic marking diverge. But if we're dealing with two independent sister systems, then we might expect that gestural marking can differ from the prosodic marking. Yeah. So if we look at first, the famous example from Ruth. So people who grow rice generally only eat rice, yeah, versus say a simple contrastive focus. Peter actually grows rice, he does not eat rice. Now in the second case, we know that rice should actually have a focus as well, but it's just de-accented due to prosodic reasoning. And so if we look at accompanying gestures, we would expect a difference, I think. And one could try to test that by looking at data like, I don't know, if you have something like an iconic gesture on eat or so, then it could be the case that in the first case, and that seems, to my intuitions, that seems to match, that you have only a gesture on the eat. So Peter actually grows rice, he does not eat rice, something like that. Yeah, so only on the eat. And then in the second case, people who grow rice generally only eat rice. So it could be a longer gesture. To my intuition, that would be fine. And that could be something to test. So that would, I think, tell the two cases apart, whether gesture really is an independent system to mark information structure. So as for the three topics that Pilar brought up for the polite stance marking, so we saw that prosody and gesture seem to both mark polite stance, prosody by reduced F0, and then gesture by less amplitude and fewer facial and body cues. And that seems to speak for cross-linguistic evidence for joint prosodic and gestural mitigation. I was just thinking whether it's really the case that this is marking. Is it really linguistic marking or just a reflection of the situation? So is there a communicative intention involved here, or is it just that we're in a situation where we speak, we don't want to speak up, we don't want to move a lot around? So maybe, yeah, that's something maybe to think about, whether that is really linguistic marking, I would say. And then again, the question whether we can tell between this sister system case and the mother-daughter relationship. So maybe gesture just aligns with a lower pitch or so. As for speech act marking, we saw that interesting result that there's the neutral polarity meaning in questions and the incredulity. And we saw that here visual input had crucial impact on the final perception, and in Catalan even more so than in Dutch. And if a visual input for the incredulity meaning actively competed with the prosodic input, then the visual cues seemed to be stronger than the auditory, which I found really interesting. And I would like to compare that to a case that we had in a little pilot study only, but there we also had visual cues versus prosodic cues. And in our case, actually the prosodic cue was stronger. So, and that was an experiment on anaphoric reference. So we tested first Peter incited Paul, and then he hit him, where we know from Lakoff that this causes the inverse reading. So he relating to Peter, to Paul, and him to Peter. And then we added gesture, yeah, and we had something like first Peter. So now we have to look at the little picture. So we pointed into the room, yeah, and we said first Peter incited Paul, and then he hit him. So we had a parallel pointing, but prosody suggested inverse reading. And what we found was that people were paying attention to the gesture. So there were less mentions for the inverse reading than without the gesture, but still the inverse reading was preferred. Yeah. So that seemed to suggest that prosody was the stronger cue here. And I'm wondering whether that's to do with that these are manual gestures, and in Pilar's case, we were talking about facial gestures, or whether there are other reasons here. Okay, and finally, information structure. So we've seen that gestures mark discourse new and accessible, and discourse accessible reference, and they add visual prominence to discourse, working in a parallel fashion to prosody. And we've also seen that there were these two types of visual cues, head and eyebrow movements, and they contribute to the perception of contrasted focus. So again, another example of gesture and prosody working together to mark information structure units. And if they do that, then I'm wondering whether they can also have the same semantic impact in these information structural contexts as intonation can. Yeah. So I was wondering about cases like the famous ones, like in English orthography, a U always follows a Q, meaning, which is true. Whenever you see a Q in English, then U has to follow it. Yeah. While what is false in English orthography, a U always follows a Q. And the question is whether you can have the same effect by, say, with beat gestures. So you keep the prosody constant and you have a beat gesture on the U versus a beat gesture on the Q, and whether that can cause like truth conditional differences. Yeah. And same with, like, for example, topic marking, as in dogs must be carried, which means when you are in a situation when you have a dog, then you have to carry it. Yeah. But it doesn't mean you have to have a dog with you to be able to enter that zone. Yeah. So yeah, so that would be something that I think would be interesting and would kind of be predicted if the two systems really work in parallel in the same way. And yeah, so that's all. Thank you, Pilar, again.
Thank you, Cornelia, very much. Well, the paper is open for discussion. Maybe Pilar wants to answer the questions. Or...
Yes, quickly. Thank you very much. I really appreciate all these comments. When I received them this morning, Cornelia was like, "Wow, no, I mean, really, really nice and really." Great for discussion. So let me just, briefly answer some of these and also start the discussion. So for, I mean, I keep completely right? I keep completely vague the sister relationship, right, in there. I just, what we see from these experiments, from many others, is that, the contribution of prosody and gesture is similar in many cases, but it's not, when I talk about it and in here, right, I mean, it was not specified, right? So the question is whether they're really independent or parasitic on each other, right? You were saying, right? So just thinking a bit more about it, I really think that these are independent in some levels and dependent on others, right? I mean, so the temporal dependency is very strong, right? In the prominence dependence is very strong. So this phonetic alignment in a way is very strong. But then, I really think also that semantically they can be really independent, right? So you have this nice example in your paper, right, about the casserole, right? You're talking about the casserole and you are indicating with the hands the form of the casserole. So immediately you put it up in the, you update the common ground in there, and any speaker that saw your indication in there can refer to it, just give it as an assumption in the conversation, right? Or if I say, she was leaving and just do this, someone can ask me, oh, why was she so much in a hurry, right? Like, I can do all these iconic, supplementary semantic meanings with gesture that contribute to, independent semantic, information, right? So that's why I really don't think we have all this list of examples on really iconic meanings, but also we have many examples on the pragmatic side, right? I mean, I can also do this incredulity phase when you are talking and you immediately see, I don't need to say even anything, right? And that, have some disagreement in there, right? And we have many of these cases in usual conversation. So it's like, we really have independent modulation. We can also find someone that is very expressive in gesture, not so much in prosody, and then you have all the meanings that were supposed to be given phonologically through your intonation contour in gesture. So I really believe that in many levels they are independent. So, but we could talk about it and have try to put the arguments clearly in there, right? Because I think we both have really thought about these. Okay, just briefly, about each of the points, right? The polite stance marking, if we're right. I mean, the question is it really, do we really have a communicative intention in there, right? When we do prosodic and gestural mitigation. So I think that one could, think about other, a way to really prove these empirically. We use hedging strategies like perhaps, right? I mean, textual strategies that in speech, whether these really are supported, in normal pragmatic communication in prosody and gesture, right? I mean, we would expect that these hedging devices agree at all levels, right? So I think that we could, these in a way would mean that this is intentional, right? Because you're make a different context, right? You are applying the same, the same strategies just to make them, make your discourse cohesive, right? But that's my view. I mean, I don't know if we can. Then, the speech act marking, right? I mean, your very nice paper, right, on inverse reading, right? And how really in this case, right, the prosodic cues were stronger, right? Because in the examples that I showed, many of the outcomes is like the McGurk effect, right? Vision has a lot of importance, right? It's very strong to us. So this is a very nice case of having intonation stronger than the vision, right? As I said in one of my emails, I was trying to really understand the role of gesture in there and whether it was really disambiguating the referent, right? So I don't think I can make a comment on your results because it would be really nice to see the videos and assess the situation. But it would actually be very nice to find examples where the intonation and gesture have different weights depending on many issues, right? So perhaps we can try to put them together and see a little bit the picture that we have right now, right? In order to make a more cohesive interpretation, right? Okay, so as for number 4, right, the information structure, right? That is a very nice question, right, about the truth conditional effects of gesture. Whether we could really find truth conditional effects, right? And you put in there the example of prominence marking, right, in both prosody and gesture. Right, the little problem, as we said also in our emails, right, the little problem here is that generally there is a very, very strong temporal relationship between gesture and prosody in respect to prominence, right? So it's very difficult. Actually, we have tried before to signal something with a beat gesture, for example, and not really put it in a prominent position, right? So, and I only know of one paper that has tried to disconnect the two, and this is Mark Swartz's paper. I don't remember the journal now, it was some years ago. And there it looked like even if you put a beat gesture in some syllable, you immediately, your processing really identifies accentuation in there, right? It's like you assume that they go together. So I don't know, I mean, perhaps I would look into other areas of gesture speech integration to look at for truth conditional effects of gesture, right? So like having these pragmatic meanings that can be also expressed only in gesture, or these complementary meanings that you can add, right? And that can have truth conditional effects. I really think so. So, but it would be nice to be able to actually put together the arguments for these, because I really believe that, like you, right, that they are there and they make a strong impact in an actual pragmatic communication, pragmatic understanding. So yeah, so I don't know if I've answered. I think I left some things, but yeah, probably that's.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like to thank Pilar and also Cornelia and all of you for joining the talk